This is a story for the spring, and it's called Victoria Gives a Flying Lesson. "Ah, tissue!" sneezed poor Victoria Plum. "Ah, tissue! Ah, tissue!" She sat down on a stool for a moment. "Oh dear," she said to herself, "all the dust and cobwebs are tickling my nose, and I can't stop sneezing." And then, as if to prove the point, she burst into another loud "Ah, tissue!" which echoed round and round her snug little sitting room. Victoria was the youngest of the woodland fairies. She was a tidy fairy, and always kept her tree house as bright as a new pin. Each spring, however, when the sunshine filtered into her home after the long, dark winter days, Victoria felt that everything needed an extra bit of polish and sparkle to start the new year with a fresh face. That morning, Victoria covered her long, dark curls in a huge cap, wrapped her best apron round her dress, and busied herself with broom and duster in every corner. "Now that the spring has come at last," she said to herself, "I really must get on with all my spring cleaning." Right in the middle of the morning, when she'd barely cleaned half the house, Benjamin knocked on the door and strolled in. Benjamin, or Ben as his friends always called him, was an elf who lived a few trees away. Victoria was always pleased to see him, but today she was much too busy to gossip. "Do stay and make yourself at home, Ben," she said, without stopping her work. "But I'm afraid I can't stop. I really must finish my spring cleaning." Ben couldn't believe his ears. "Why do you bother?" he asked. "It's such a waste of effort. After all, you are a fairy, so why don't you just magic everything clean? I know I would." Victoria knew very well what Ben would do if his house needed spring cleaning. He was one of Victoria's closest friends, but he was an elf, and as everyone knows, elves do not like work. "If you won't use your magic," he said, "then let me use mine." "Oh no," said Victoria, "that would be cheating. Besides, I like spring cleaning." And with that, she disappeared in a cloud of dust and burst into yet another fit of sneezing. "You are impossible," said Ben grumpily, "but I'm not going to give in. If you won't let me magic away the housework, well, at least let me cure your sneezing." "Certainly not," replied Victoria. "We both know what happened the last time you tried that spell." Ben remembered the fun he'd had trying to cure Mole of his sneezing, and he laughed and laughed until the tears ran down his cheeks. And although she thought she shouldn't, Victoria couldn't help laughing too. Ben was bored watching Victoria work while he did nothing, so he took out his flute. "There is something I can do for you, you know," he said. "I'll play my flute, and then you'll have music while you work." When Ben began to play, the air was filled with a strange squeaky noise as the notes tumbled from the flute without melody or tune. Ben thought it was the coolest, sweetest music he'd ever played. Victoria thought it was awful. She didn't want to hurt his feelings by asking him to stop playing, so she allowed herself just a tiny piece of magic. In her imagination, she turned the squawky noise into beautiful music, and then she smiled. Ben was delighted that he'd pleased his friend at last, and he played with extra enthusiasm. That made the noise even worse, but inside her head Victoria could hear only the prettiest of tunes, and she finished her work in no time at all. When the last book was dusted and the broom returned to its cupboard, Victoria took off her apron and cap and folded them away. Then she realized that her hard work had made her very hungry. "What I would like now is a refreshing cup of blackberry juice and a nice bowl of rose-hip salad," she said. "Would you like to stay for tea, Ben?" He knew what a marvellous cook Victoria was, and was at the tea table before Victoria could even blink. While she prepared the tea, Victoria was thinking how lovely her home looked, and how lucky she was to live in the rambling old house nestling under the roots of the huge beech tree on the edge of the great wood. The tree grew out of an old stone wall. There were so many nooks and crannies in the wall that it made a perfect home for all sorts of woodland creatures. With so many friends close by, she could never be lonely, as there was always someone dropping in to say hello. Suddenly, Victoria's daydream was interrupted. The blue tit burst into the room and tumbled in a heap on the floor. His feathers were ruffled and he was quite out of breath. He was so excited that his message came jumbling out in a breathless muddle, and the only words Victoria could understand were cat and baby robin. Eventually, she calmed him down enough to understand the reason for his panic. One of the baby robins had fallen out of its nest, and the cat, who lived in the big house, was lying flat in the long grass, waiting to grab the little bird. "And it's only a matter of seconds before he pounces," said the blue tit dramatically. Victoria knew exactly where the robins had built their nest, in the thick hedge near the bottom of the garden. Without wasting another moment, she flew off through the trees as fast as her tiny wings would carry her, leaving Ben with his mouth full of hazelnut cake. As she flew towards the hedge, Victoria could see the young robin's parents diving on the cat and twittering at her to leave their baby alone. Then she spotted the cat, crouching low in the grass, tail flicking, whiskers twitching. She couldn't see the baby robin anywhere. "Oh no, don't say I've come too late," she whispered. Then she saw the tiny bird. His baby feathers of speckled brown had made him almost invisible against the earth. Victoria heaved a sigh of relief and settled on a primrose a short distance away. She whispered to him to stay quite still while she tried to work out what to do next. It was no use trying to frighten the cat away. The robins had already tried that without success. "I know," she thought. "I'll drop a sleeping potion in her eyes and make her fall asleep just long enough for—" "Oh, you silly, empty-headed fairy," she said out loud, as she remembered that all her potions were back at home, and in her hurry to get to the nest she'd left everything behind. "Oh, it would take just too long to go back," she muttered. "I've got to do something now." Suddenly, Victoria had a marvellous idea. "Oh, yes," she cried with relief. "He's bound to help." And just as she was about to fly off, Ben turned up. He was never one to hurry himself, and he'd stayed to finish his hazelnut cake at Victoria's house. "You stay near the baby robin," she called to him, "and while I'm away, do something to distract that cat." "Like what?" said Ben. "I don't know," called Victoria. "You're the one who always has bright ideas for playing practical jokes. You think of something." And before Ben could take another breath, Victoria had flown off through the flowers. "Don't be too long," he shouted after her. "I don't like cats either." Ben looked at the cat and shuddered. Then he thought of all the new tricks he could try out, and he smiled. He wouldn't be unkind, but he would make sure that the cat was so busy trying to get rid of him that she wouldn't even think about the baby robin. Ben couldn't remember when he'd had so much fun. But however hard he worked, the cat stayed just close enough to pounce on the robin. After 10 minutes of jumping and tickling, Ben was worn out. He ducked inside a daffodil to rest. "I don't know where you've gone, Victoria," he puffed, "but if you don't come back soon, I shall run out of ideas." Victoria had, in fact, flown in search of Mr. P, the kind old gardener at the big house. He fed all the birds and knew where they hid their nests. When he'd found the robin's nest, the very first nest that spring, he took a special interest and kept the cat away. After searching everywhere, Victoria finally spotted his bright red hat bobbing above the fence near the vegetable patch. She fluttered over the fence and landed on Mr. P's hat. "I wonder how my robins are today," she whispered in his ear. It was the gentlest of fairy whispers, to make Mr. P believe he'd thought of the words himself. But he took no notice and just went on planting lettuces. "I wonder how my robins are today," whispered Victoria again. But still Mr. P went on planting. "Oh, do listen," urged Victoria, almost in despair. This time, the gardener sat back and said, "I haven't seen my robins today. I wonder how they are." "At last," sighed Victoria, flying after Mr. P. who was already striding down the garden. Before he'd even reached the hedge, he saw the cat rolling on the grass. He couldn't see Ben, of course, because elves and fairies are almost always invisible to humans. But his sharp eyes saw the robins and their baby, and he guessed what was happening. "Oh, no, you don't, my beauty," he said, scooping the cat into his arms. "I'll put you out of harm's way." And to the relief of everyone, he carried the cat away. As soon as Mr. P had gone, they began to encourage the robin to fly back to the safety of the nest. But he was so scared that he couldn't move a muscle. Neither Victoria nor Ben had the sort of powerful magic that could make birds fly. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't make the baby robin move. At last, Victoria said, "There's only one thing to do, Ben. You and I will have to carry him back." Ben gasped and was about to object, but Victoria looked determined, so he said nothing. They stood on either side of the bird, linked their arms underneath his body, and gently lifted him off the ground. "If you ask me," panted Ben as they struggled upwards, "little birds eat too much. He's heavy." Victoria couldn't answer. The robin was very heavy, and she needed all her breath to carry him. Her tiny wings worked harder than they'd ever done before. Every moment the bird got heavier and heavier, and poor Victoria thought her arms would break. "We'll never do it. I can't keep this up," she puffed. "Nor me," gulped Ben, and he gave the robin a prod in the ribs. "Silly bird. You should be able to fly on your own without all this fuss." The little robin didn't like being prodded, so he flapped his wings a little to make himself more comfortable. "Go on," encouraged Victoria. "Flap a bit more, and you'll fly." The robin flapped his fat little wings harder, and with a jerk and a flutter, he flew into the nest. Ben and Victoria both tumbled in an exhausted heap. While they caught their breath, the robins fussed over their naughty baby. "We don't know how to thank you," they said. "What can we do to repay your kindness?" Now, Ben was an elf who never missed an opportunity. "Well, there is something I'd like," he said. "As you know, I play the flute. Rather well, actually. But I've always admired your beautiful singing. Would you teach me some of your songs so that I can play them on my flute?" Mr. Robin was delighted to be paid such a generous compliment. It was true, he did have a beautiful voice, and in the summer he filled the woods with his lovely singing. "Why, I'd be happy to teach you," he said. "Come again in June when the youngsters have left home, and I'll have plenty of time to teach you to sing." Ben was thrilled. He said goodbye to his friends and then promptly fell asleep on the branch. "There must be a way of saying a special thank you to you, Victoria," said the robins. But Victoria didn't really want any reward. She'd been happy to help, and that was enough. But she was just too tired to argue. Without another word, the robins tucked their heads under their wings and plucked the softest, whitest down feathers Victoria had ever seen. "Why, they're perfect," she cried. "Thank you. They're just what I need to make a warm collar for my best winter coat. What a lovely way to end a tiring day." This is a story for the summertime, and it's called Victoria Goes Fishing. Victoria Plum looked out of the window at the bright sun and the clear blue sky and decided it was far too nice a day to stay indoors. She daydreamed about lying in the hot sun, paddling her toes in the cool, clear river. "Are you daydreaming, Victoria?" The stern voice of her teacher brought Victoria back to earth with a bump. She wasn't out in the sunshine after all, but sitting at a desk piled high with school books, with a rather cross-looking teacher standing in front of her. "It's no good wishing you could be outside when there's work to be done," he said, and then he smiled to show that he wasn't very cross. "The sooner we finish, the sooner we can all enjoy this lovely day," he added. "So, let's hurry on." And with that, he balanced his spectacles on the end of his nose and started reading aloud from one of his huge old books. Although everyone in the Great Wood called Victoria Plum a woodland fairy, she was only a very junior fairy and still had many things to learn before she could become a real fairy with a full set of magic wings. Every week, Victoria and her friend Benjamin, who was a woodland elf, went to the home of the old alchemist to learn all they could about magic. He was one of the oldest gnomes in the Great Wood and knew more about magic than anyone else there. He had once lived in the fairy kingdom and had worked on some of the fairies' most important spells. At last, the old man put down his book and looked at them over the top of his little gold spectacles. "I'm going to teach you two how to disappear," he said in a very serious voice. Victoria and Ben couldn't believe their ears. They both knew that only the most senior fairies could make things disappear, and they were very junior fairies. It would be years before they had enough magic to cast such an important spell as that. "We can't possibly do that," gasped Victoria. "We're not nearly clever enough." The old man just smiled at them. "What you must remember," he said, "is that you don't always need magic to get what you want. Sometimes you can do the cleverest things without using magic at all." Ben and Victoria were still puzzled. Then they saw that the old man wasn't just smiling, he was chuckling, and then laughing. "Why don't you both disappear?" he said. "Go home. Go out into the wood and enjoy the sunshine. That's how you make yourselves disappear without using magic. Perhaps then at your next lesson we can get some work done." Victoria and Ben didn't wait to hear any more. They gathered up their books, said a hurried goodbye, and disappeared from the room and out into the warmth of the lovely summer day. They walked on down the path which ran through the trees to the edge of a small river. Victoria could hear it happily chuckling and gurgling over the stones, and as they drew nearer, she could see the sun glinting and sparkling on the water through the trees. "Let's have a paddle," said Victoria, and before Ben had time to say a word, she'd flown along the path, put down her books, and was sitting on the grassy river bank, hurriedly pulling off her shoes and socks. "I shall sit here in the warm sunshine on this smooth, grassy bank and dangle my toes in the water for the rest of the day," she thought, as she leaned back against a tree. She watched a cloud of small flies hovering above the river, busily turning this way and that as though they couldn't make up their minds where they were going. A dragonfly flashed by in a streak of brilliant blue on some urgent message, and the black and white dipper birds bobbed and curtsied impatiently on the rocks in the river. When they called out to her, "What are you doing today, Victoria?" the little woodland fairy just smiled and replied happily, "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I'm having a day off." And she closed her eyes so that everyone would think she was asleep and wouldn't disturb her. Ben was dozing in the shade of a tree. Its branches stretched out over the river so that the leaves on the very tip danced on the surface of the water. They made a gentle burbling noise that helped him to sleep. Suddenly, he and Victoria were startled by a loud splash. They both looked at the water and saw a long stream of silver bubbles. Then there was a whoosh of water and an even louder splash. And there, sitting up on his hind legs in the middle of the river, was a young otter. "Hello," he said breathlessly. "I hope I didn't startle you, but I can't remember when I've had to swim so fast." And he lay on his back in the water to catch his breath. "Why is everybody rushing about?" said Ben. "Why can't you have a day off like Victoria and I and lie in the sun?" Otter cleaned his whiskers, scratched himself and said, I was having a day off. I was lying in the sun. That's the trouble. He gave his whiskers another comb with his soft paws. There I was, having a quiet snooze in a patch of sunlight, when I was hit on the head with a stone. He pointed to a red bump on his head. It hurts too, he said, rubbing it gently with his paw. Why would anyone want to throw stones at you? Asked Victoria. Well, said Otter, they weren't actually throwing stones at me. They were throwing them at a tin can, but they missed and hit me instead. Who are they? Asked Ben. Otter twitched his whiskers. Them, he said, those children from the village. They've come down to the river to fish, but they were bored and started throwing stones instead. All the young fish are terrified. They want to swim further down the river, but they daren't go past the children in case they're caught on their fishing hooks. Otter shivered at the thought of those fishing hooks and then darted under the water again as if to escape. When he came up by the edge of the bank, Victoria smiled at him and said, "Tell me where the children are, Otter. We must think of some way to stop them catching all those young fish." "They're on the far side of the river, by the deep pool," replied Otter. "But please, don't ask me to come back with you. I'm not very brave, and I don't like meeting people." And he looked at Victoria with such big, sad eyes that Victoria said she was sure that she and Ben could manage on their own. Ben was not at all sure, but Victoria was already flying across the top of the water and heading for the deep pool. "Ah, well," sighed Ben, "I suppose I'd better be off too." And he flew off after Victoria. Victoria soon found the children. They were sitting on the bank, all laughing and saying they would be the first to catch a fish. She looked into the deep pool and could see the young fish swimming around in circles. They were frightened to swim past the children in case they were caught, but they didn't want to stay in the deep pool either. "What shall we do, Victoria?" they cried. Victoria sat on the bank and thought hard. Very soon Ben arrived. "All right," he said. "What marvellous scheme have you come up with this time?" Victoria shook her head sadly. She knew that neither she nor Ben had enough magic to make the children go away, though that was exactly what she wanted them to do. While Victoria went on thinking, Ben flew over to the other side of the pool to have a closer look at the children. They couldn't see Ben, of course, for although the woodland creatures can see the fairies, they're almost always invisible to humans. Ben flew back to Victoria again. "They're a useless bunch," he said. "If you ask me, even if they did catch a fish, they wouldn't know the difference between a trout and an old boot." Victoria jumped up as if she'd been stuck with a pin. "Oh, Ben, you are clever," she cried. "You found the answer right away." "I only said they couldn't tell the difference between a trout and an old boot," said Ben. "Exactly," replied Victoria. "Remember what our teacher told us this morning? He said you can do the cleverest things without using magic at all." Ben nodded doubtfully. "Look, it's simple," said Victoria. "We don't want the children to catch the fish, so we give them something else to catch, like old boots." At last Ben understood the plan. "We'll have to use a bit of magic," said Victoria, "just to persuade them that they really are catching something special." Victoria put her hand into her pocket and brought out some fairy dust. She flew across to the children, sprinkled fairy dust in their eyes, and chanted a secret fairy spell. Then she flew back to Ben. "Now for stage 2 of the plan," she said. "I was supposed to be having a day off," grumbled Ben. "Oh, I know," replied Victoria, "but this could be so much more fun. Look, all you have to do is fly along the riverbank and collect all the rubbish you can find. Then we'll work a spell to make sure that the children catch it on their lines." Ben still didn't look very happy. "Look," said Victoria, "there's an old rusty kettle and a bicycle wheel." Ben could never resist a challenge and flew off to search. Very carefully and very quietly, Victoria put the kettle into the water so that it didn't splash. Then she watched as it drifted towards the fishing lines. The handle caught in one of the hooks and pulled the line tight. "We've caught something!" the children shouted, and they wound in the line and found the kettle dangling on the end. Victoria kept her fingers crossed and hoped that her spell had worked. As she watched, they began to laugh and clap their hands with delight. "What a smashing bit of treasure!" cried one. "I've never caught a kettlefish before," laughed another, and the third said, "I wonder what other treasures we can catch." And he threw his line back into the water to see what else he could find. Almost at once he caught the old bicycle wheel. "I've caught another treasure!" he shouted, and as he pulled in the line, the wheel slowly came out of the pool. The bright summer sun sparkled on all the tiny drops of water that clung to the rim and the spokes of the wheel. One of the children shouted, "Oh, look, it's all covered in fairy lights." And Victoria had a little chuckle to herself. Little do you know, she thought. While the three children were examining their finds, Ben flew back to the deep pool. "It's all arranged, Victoria," he said. "I found loads of rubbish lying around on the river bank. You'd never believe the things some people throw away. It should keep the children amused for hours." Every time they pulled one thing off their fishing hooks, Victoria and Ben dropped something else into the water a little way upstream, so that by the end of the morning the children had a large collection of treasures piled on the bank beside them. At last the children thought they'd caught enough. "I'll race you home!" the boy shouted, and they all chased after him through the trees. When everything was quiet, Ben and Victoria flew out into the middle of the pond to make sure the children had gone. Then they called down to the young fish who were still trying to hide in the shade of the river bank. "It's all right. The children have gone. You can come out now. It's quite safe." One by one, the fish poked their noses out into the deeper water in the centre of the pool. "Oh, thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Ben," they gurgled under the water, and they swam round and round, chasing their tails with delight now that they knew they were safe. "Remember where we live," called Victoria. As she waved goodbye to them, she watched their silver bodies streak through the water as they chased each other over the stones and between the reeds down the river. "So much for my day off," laughed Ben. "I think I'll be off before anything else happens." Ben gathered up his books and his pipes, said goodbye to Victoria, and whizzed off back to his house for some tea. Victoria picked up her school books and was just about to fly home for tea herself when something on the far bank caught her eye. It was a sudden flash of green light which seemed to come from the long grass. Whatever was that, she thought, and flew over to investigate. There on the ground she saw a lovely green glass bottle that the children had fished out of the river. Victoria picked up the bottle and held it towards the sun, so that the light flashed and danced inside the tiny bottle like green fire. "This is much too beautiful to leave lying around," she thought, "and I know the very place for it." She took the bottle home and put it on the windowsill in her bedroom. It made a perfect vase for a bunch of crisp white daisies, and in the mornings, when the sun shone through the window, the little green bottle caught the sunbeams and looked as though it was full of sparkling green lights. "I'm so glad we let the children fish for treasure in the river," thought Victoria, "because they've left me the best treasure of all." A lovely day. This is a story for the autumn, Victoria and the Prickly Hedgehog. It was early morning in the great wood. Everyone was still sound asleep, and nothing stirred. The birds were silent, the mice were curled up with their dreams, and even the wind had settled down for a nap. Very slowly, the sun rose up over the hill. Then it started to creep silently with long, shiny fingers through the leaves and the branches of the trees in the great wood. The blackbird felt the sun tickle his back, and he ruffled his feathers, flapped his wings a little, and woke up. "My goodness," he said, "is it morning already? I could sleep for another hour." But Blackbird was the one creature in the wood who could never have a lie-in. He was always the first one to wake up, and it was his job to wake everyone else, including the fairy Victoria Plum. He tidied up his feathers, gave a little cough to clear his throat, and then let out a long burst of happy song. He sang to his neighbours, "Good morning, good morning, time to get up." And when all the woodland creatures around him had opened their eyes, Blackbird swooped off through the trees and perched on a branch outside Victoria's lovely old tree house, as he did every morning, rain or shine throughout the year. "Good morning, Victoria," he sang. "It's a lovely day." Inside her snug little bedroom, Victoria heard the blackbird's beautiful song. It was the first sound she heard every day, her own very special alarm clock. Victoria couldn't think of a nicer way to start the day. Sometimes she would give herself a few extra minutes in bed and just lie there listening to the beautiful song. But not today. Today was going to be a very busy one for her. She threw back the bedclothes and ran to the window to wave to the blackbird outside. Then she set about getting herself washed and dressed. She made a bowl of oat porridge for breakfast, drank a whole glass of apple juice, and said to herself, "Now, let's get to work." She pulled on her gloves, picked up a large basket, and went out into the great wood. It was autumn, and that meant that the trees and hedges were loaded with fat berries and sweet nuts. The whole wood was like a huge marketplace, with fresh fruit just waiting to be picked. All the creatures in the wood knew that in the autumn they had to gather in as much food as they could and store it away to eat during the winter. Even fairies like Victoria couldn't magic food onto the trees, so Victoria had to start collecting food for her own winter store. First, she set off to find her favourite blackberry hedge. Victoria loved blackberries. Victoria was so busy picking, and sometimes eating, the blackberries, that she didn't see or hear anything or anyone for a whole hour. The blackbird was right, she thought. It is a lovely day. All around her the colours of autumn shone in the crisp morning sunshine, and Victoria was glad that she'd got up so early. It would have been a pity to waste such a beautiful morning. Suddenly, she realised she had a visitor. Somewhere on the other side of the blackberry hedge, she could hear a snorting and snuffling, as if someone had a bad cold. Victoria looked over the hedge, and there to her surprise she saw Old Hedgehog. He was usually asleep during the day, and only came out at night to shuffle about the wood. "This is a surprise," said Victoria. "I don't often see you about at this time of the morning." The old hedgehog just grunted. Before Victoria even had time to ask him if his rheumatism was any better, he went scurrying off down one of the narrow, twisty paths. Victoria didn't expect to see Old Hedgehog again until the spring, because, like the rest of his family, he hated the cold of the winter. He always went to bed in October and stayed there in a deep, deep sleep until it was warm again. A few days later, however, Victoria did see the old chap again. She'd almost filled her basket when she caught sight of Old Hedgehog bustling through the undergrowth. She saw him disappear underneath a thick bramble hedge, but he came out a moment later looking disappointed. Then he ran into the hollow of a tree stump. But again he ran out, looking rather cross and very unhappy. What can he be looking for? Thought Victoria to herself. So she called out to Old Hedgehog. "Good morning. Have you lost something? Can I help you look for it?" The old fellow didn't seem to hear. He just went on scurrying from tree to hedge and back again, muttering to himself. "No, it just will not do. It will not do at all." Victoria had no idea of what it was that would not do, so she left Old Hedgehog to search on his own and began to walk back to her house. The path was covered in a carpet of crisp, dry leaves, and they crunched and crackled as Victoria skipped lightly over them. "What are you doing?" said a voice. Victoria stopped and looked around. She couldn't see anyone. Then a small pile of leaves rustled, and out popped a young hedgehog. Victoria was very surprised indeed. "Good gracious me," she said, "another hedgehog! I thought you'd all be tucked up in your nests fast asleep by now. I didn't expect to see any more hedgehogs until the spring." The little hedgehog looked at her with bright button eyes and said, "Well, I will be asleep soon, but I felt a bit peckish, and it was such a nice warm day I thought I'd come out for one last feast of worms and beetles." Victoria looked more closely at the young hedgehog. He'd been born in the wood that year and was one of the smallest youngsters she'd ever seen. Victoria suspected that his real reason for being out in the wood was that he hadn't found a nest for the winter and was just pretending that he was looking for worms. Victoria didn't want to embarrass the little hedgehog, so she said, "Is your nest very far from here?" "Oh no," said the youngster eagerly. "It's just over there." And he pointed to an old pile of logs that had been left near a thick bramble hedge. "There's a small hollow underneath the logs," said the little hedgehog. "It's warm and snug and beautifully lined with moss and sweet grass. I think it's the best nest in the whole wood." "I thought Old Hedgehog lived there," said Victoria. "Oh yes, he did," said the youngster. "He's my uncle. I met him in the wood one day and told him that I couldn't find anywhere to sleep for the winter, even though I'd searched in every nook and cranny. And he said that I could have his nest. He said it was time he made a move, and he knew the wood so well he'd find a new home in no time." At last Victoria knew what it was that the poor old hedgehog had been looking for. He had kindly given away his nest, and now he had no home for the cold winter. Victoria couldn't bear to think what might happen to him if he couldn't find somewhere soon. So she said goodbye to the youngster and hurried back to her own house, determined to think of a way to help. As she walked towards her home, Victoria could hear a strange squawky tune, which got louder as she went on. "That must be Ben," she thought to herself. "No one else plays tunes like that." And when she arrived, sure enough, her friend Ben the elf was sitting on the step playing his pipes. When he saw her, he put down the pipes and shouted, "Come on, Victoria! Where on earth have you been? I've been sitting here for ages waiting for you. You really do make the most delicious jam, Victoria. I suppose you wouldn't have a spare pot, would you?" Victoria laughed. "Of course you can have a jar of jam," said Victoria, "but you'll have to work for it. You must help me stack away this basket of chestnuts and hazelnuts in my storeroom." Eventually they were finished. Victoria put the last nut in place, then closed the door, and she and Ben made their way back to the kitchen. As they walked along the winding corridors of Victoria's tree house, Ben said to her, "You know what I think? I think this house is much too big for you." Victoria thought for a moment and then smiled to herself. "You are right, Ben," she said. "I really should find something to fill these empty rooms, and I think I know the very thing." Poor Ben didn't have a clue what she was talking about. That night, Victoria set to work on a plan to make sure that at least one of the empty rooms in her house would be filled. The next afternoon, Victoria went out again into the great wood with her basket. She began collecting a few nuts and berries, but what she was really looking for was Old Hedgehog. It didn't take her very long to find him. He was snuffling for worms and insects through a pile of dead leaves near an old wasp's nest at the foot of a tree. Victoria called out to him, "Good afternoon, Old Hedgehog. I see you found yourself a nice, cosy nest in time for the cold winter." The hedgehog looked up from his work. Yes," he said, although Victoria thought he didn't sound too sure. "A nest like this is ideal for an old-timer like me." Victoria could see at a glance that it wasn't a very good nest at all. The roof had fallen in, and there was a large hole in the side where the winter winds would worry and poke at the hedgehog and probably keep him awake when he ought to be asleep. "Oh dear," she thought to herself, "he'll never be warm in there, and I know he's only pretending to like the nest so that I won't worry about him." So she decided to put her plan into action there and then. "I do hope it works," she whispered to herself. "Old Hedgehog," she said, "look, as you'll soon be going into your nest to sleep for the winter, I wondered if you'd like to come and have tea with me this afternoon." He couldn't resist Victoria's invitation, so he thanked her and said he would love to come to tea. And without more ado, they set off for Victoria's home, chatting a little as they walked along. Old Hedgehog ate very slowly. When they were finished, he warmed his toes by the fire and said how nice it was to be in such a snug, comfortable home. Victoria even thought, but wasn't quite sure, that she saw a little teardrop glistening in his old eye as he sat in her cosy armchair by the warm fire and began to fall asleep. Victoria asked Old Hedgehog if he'd like to see the rest of the house, and they went off on a tour of inspection. They walked down the twisty, winding corridors, past the rooms where Victoria kept her winter food. They went past the rooms where she stored her magic books and potions, and the rooms where she stored her favourite treasures. She even showed him the empty rooms deep in the heart of the tree. There were so many rooms that by the time they'd finished looking at the house, it was very late, and outside it was dark and had started to rain. "I'm sure you don't want to go all the way home on a cold, wet night like this," said Victoria to Old Hedgehog. "Why not stay here?" The proud old hedgehog was about to say no, so Victoria added quickly, "As you've seen, I have plenty of spare rooms, so it would be no trouble. And because I live on my own in this big house, it would be very nice indeed to have company for a change." Old Hedgehog thought for a moment, and then he said, "I would like that very much, Victoria. Thank you." That night, Old Hedgehog snuggled down in a bed of dry leaves, sweet-smelling grass, and soft green moss in one of Victoria's spare rooms. "Ooh, this is nice," he said. "Very nice indeed." And in no time at all, he fell fast asleep. The next morning, Victoria peeked into his room and saw that he was blissfully happy. His head and tiny feet were tucked away like a neat little parcel, so that all that she could see was a tightly curled ball of spikes lying in the middle of a deep, soft bed. She knew that for the rest of the autumn and all through the winter, Old Hedgehog would be quite safe and would go on sleeping peacefully until the spring came round again. He didn't wake up once, but Victoria was sure that he was happy, because on quiet winter evenings, when everything in the wood was still, she could hear from deep inside the old beech tree the long, low sound of a contented hedgehog snoring. This is a story for the winter, Victoria's Snowflake Net. All day in the great wood it had rained and rained and rained. Not the gentle rain of spring, nor the boisterous showers that interrupt the warmth of a summer's day, but the cold, hard, grey rain that says, winter is here. Victoria Plum sat in front of the fire in her rambling old tree house and warmed her toes and fingers. Outside, the wind was tearing at the trees, and the rain had turned the wood into a wet, soggy mess. Today is definitely a day for staying indoors, thought Victoria, and she snuggled down into her comfortable old beanbag with a cup of barley soup and a book. Victoria was so engrossed in the story that she didn't notice the flames of the fire gradually dying. Suddenly she felt chilly. Where the flames had been dancing, there was now a pile of cold grey ash. "Oh, silly me," muttered Victoria. "Now I shall have to light the fire again." She set to work with paper and kindling, and in no time at all the sticks were crackling and the fire filled Victoria's room with a warm glow. The log basket in the corner was now almost empty. "I'd better fill that up," she thought to herself. "I don't want the fire going out again." Victoria kept a store of logs outside her kitchen. When she opened the door, the house was filled with the sound of splattering rain and angry wind. As she piled the logs into the basket, she thought she heard another noise above the roar of the storm. That wasn't the wind, she thought, or the rain. It was only a very faint noise, but it sounded to Victoria as if someone was crying out. "Is anyone out there?" shouted Victoria. "Yes, I'm over here," replied a very faint voice. The rain was so heavy it was like a thick, watery curtain. Poor Victoria could hardly see a thing. "Wait a minute," she called. "I'm coming." And she dashed indoors to pull on her raincoat and Wellingtons. She began searching, but she couldn't find anything. Then she moved towards a pile of stones. As she moved closer, the noise grew louder. "I'm over here," said the voice. Victoria decided that whoever needed help must be invisible, because although she could hear them clearly, she still couldn't see anyone. "I'm under the stone," called the voice. Looking down, Victoria could just see the tip of a leg pointing out from underneath a stone. She ran round to the other side and saw a poor little spider who had 2 of its 8 legs trapped by the stone. "How did you get there?" asked Victoria. "Oh, I know it sounds silly," said the spider, "but I came out to make sure that my webs hadn't been blown away. I was walking along in the shelter of this wall when I was showered with earth and stones. The next thing I knew, I was trapped under this stone." Victoria felt sorry for the spider, but she knew that the stone was too heavy for her to lift on her own, and who would help? "There's nothing for it," she decided at last. "I shall have to ask Ben." "Benjamin," she called. "Benjamin." Normally, of course, Victoria's tiny fairy voice would never have been heard above the noise of the storm. So she used the fairy code to carry her gentle voice through the rain, over the trees, past the wind, right up to the door of Ben's house. Ben was curled up in bed with the covers pulled over his head so he wouldn't have to listen to the rain. The last thing an elf like Ben wanted to do was to go out into the storm. At first, he pretended not to hear Victoria's fairy call, and he crawled further under the covers with his hands over his ears. When she called out again, he knew he would have to go to find out what she wanted, and he arrived there in a twinkling. "Well, Victoria Plum," said a very cross and very wet Benjamin, "I hope you've got a good excuse for getting me out of my warm, dry house on a stormy day like this." "Yes, I have," replied Victoria. "This poor spider is trapped underneath a big stone, and I need your special strength to help me lift it up." Victoria knew very well that if she flattered Ben, he'd soon stop being cross, and when he realized that Victoria couldn't manage without him, he was only too willing to help. "Leave it to me," said Ben, puffing out his chest to show how strong he was. "I'll soon have her free." Together they set to work. Ben used all his strength to lift the stone, and Victoria helped with her strongest spell. With Ben puffing and pushing, and Victoria chanting the magic words to herself, slowly the stone rolled away and released the spider's legs. Ben took a deep breath, stretched his aching muscles and said, "Right, that's it then, I'm off." And before anyone had a chance to say, "Elf," he was gone. "Well, fancy that," said the spider, very surprised. "Oh, don't mind him," replied Victoria. "It's just his way." Victoria looked closely at the spider. The two legs which had been trapped were broken, and she was clearly in no state to look after herself. "If you can manage to walk on your 6 good legs and come into my house," said Victoria, "I have lotions and potions there that will mend the broken ones." The poor spider was very grateful. "Ah," said the spider when they were inside, "what a lovely fire." This time the fire hadn't gone out, so the spider settled herself down in front of the hearth to get warm and dry. Victoria went into the room at the back of the house where she kept the jars and bottles and books that held all her magic secrets. She wanted very much to cast a single spell that would cure the spider in seconds, but she was too young to know how to use the powerful magic of the senior fairies. Instead, she would have to use one of her special fairy ointments. It might take a little longer, but at least she knew it would work. The first thing she did was to open her magic recipe book. She did not want to mix up the wrong ointment, so she followed the recipe exactly. A spoonful of essence of dew, a sprinkling of fairy dust, a pinch of powdered gossamer, and a drop of liquid from a bottle marked "something special." When the ingredients were mixed together, she smoothed the ointment onto the spider's legs. The spider started to feel better almost at once. "What we need now are some splints to hold your legs in place while the ointment works," said Victoria. She went into her store and found 2 pine needles. "They're just the job," she declared, and gently bound them in place to each of the legs. "I'm afraid it may be a bit uncomfortable for a few days," Victoria told the spider, "but after that you'll be as right as rain." Victoria liked having a guest in the house. She spent much of the time alone during the winter, because most of her friends did not like the cold and damp, and only came out when it was fine. Once a week, Victoria flew to the heart of the great wood, to the house where the old alchemist lived. There she learnt about herbs and potions, spells and magic, for the old man had once worked with the fairies in the fairy kingdom. But now he preferred the peace and quiet of the countryside, where he could read his books, discover new magic, and help the junior fairies with their homework. Victoria was very fond of the old man, but she couldn't visit him every day, so each winter she spent long days walking by herself in the woods and sitting by the fire reading all her favourite books. Victoria loved to read. She liked adventure stories and mystery stories, but best of all, she liked fairy stories. She would sit for hours reading about the fairy kingdom where all the senior fairies and woodland spirits lived, and about the wonderful magic they did there. Now that Victoria had a friend in the house, she read her books out loud so that the spider could enjoy them as well. The spider stayed with Victoria for nearly 2 weeks. When the time came for Victoria to take off the splints, she saw that the ointment had worked perfectly, and the 2 legs were as good as new. Victoria didn't really want her friend to go. She'd enjoyed her company, and they'd become such good friends. But the spider had a home of her own, and now that she was well again, she was anxious to get back. As she said goodbye at the door of the house, she told Victoria, "You have been so very kind and so generous that if ever I can help you in any way, you only have to ask." Victoria said she would, and they both promised to keep in touch and stay good friends forever. During the next few weeks, the days became colder and colder. Then, early one morning, Victoria awoke to a gentle swoosh plop, swoosh plop noise outside. She hopped out of bed and peeped through the window. The sky was full of the fattest, fluffiest snowflakes she'd ever seen. They were tumbling down between the trees and piling up on the ground in soft white folds. "Oh, how beautiful!" cried Victoria. As she watched, everything in the wood began to change. The dark brown earth became a glittering white carpet. The jagged old tree stump was turned into a fairy castle. The trees that had stood bare were hung with delicate white flowers, which blossomed and grew as the snow fell. By lunchtime, the snow had stopped. The clouds blew away, and the sun shone out of a clear blue sky. The sunbeams danced over the snowflakes, making everything sparkle. Victoria decided she had never seen the wood looking so pretty. Just then she caught sight of Ben flying through the trees with what looked like a flying carpet. "Come on, Victoria," he shouted. "I've made a toboggan to play with." He jumped on his toboggan and skimmed down one of the steepest drifts, so fast that when he reached the bottom of the slope he disappeared into a deep bank of snow. Victoria heard a giggle from the pile of snow and saw it wriggle as Ben popped out, grinning from ear to ear. Victoria had never been on a toboggan before, and it looked great fun. She pulled on her boots and warm coat and popped on a snug woolly hat to keep her ears warm. Ben had pulled the toboggan back to the top of the slope. "Go on," he said. "Climb on and have a go." Victoria sat on the toboggan, held on tight, and very gingerly began to push herself down the snowy hill. "Not like that," laughed Ben. "Put some effort into it." And he gave her a mighty push. Off went Victoria with the wind rushing in her face as she slid faster and faster down the steep slope. She wasn't at all frightened. In fact, she enjoyed it so much that when she got to the bottom, she couldn't wait to fly back to the top and have another go. They were both so busy playing that neither of them noticed the puppy. He came bouncing through the trees, scattering snow in all directions, and almost collided with Victoria and Ben. That was the start of the biggest snowball fight there'd ever been in the Great Wood. And when all three were quite exhausted and couldn't think of any more games to play, Ben said he thought it was time he went home for tea. All that fresh air and exercise had made him hungry. He said goodbye to the puppy and Victoria and flew off through the trees, taking his toboggan with him. Victoria and the puppy began to walk home together. "Thank you for letting me join in your games, Victoria," said the puppy. "I had no idea snow could be such fun." "But if you didn't come out to play in the snow," asked Victoria, "why were you racing through the wood?" The puppy looked a little sad. "I was trying to catch the snowflakes," he replied. "I heard my master say that every snowflake has the most beautiful pictures locked inside. He said they were made from ice, and no matter how many snowflakes fell, each picture was different. It sounded so beautiful that I so wanted to see for myself. But each time I caught a snowflake, it disappeared before I had time to see anything at all." Victoria didn't like to see the puppy looking sad, but she knew that delicate snowflakes were one of the most difficult things in the world to catch. But then she had an idea. "You wait here," she told the puppy. "I think I know how we can catch a snowflake." Victoria flew off into the wood, and while the puppy was still wondering what she could mean, she was back again, bringing her friend, the spider. Victoria had already explained that the puppy wanted to see the snowflakes, so, without asking any questions, the spider climbed onto a nearby bramble bush. Victoria brushed away the snow so that two of the branches were quite clear, and then the clever spider set to work. The little puppy was spellbound. He watched as the creature started to make her web. Backwards and forwards she went, then round and round as if she was weaving the finest lace. Only minutes later she was finished, and there, between the branches of the bush, was a perfect snowflake net. The puppy scampered round and round with delight. "Oh, you are so clever," he said to the spider. "Not at all," she replied. "The fairies always catch the early morning dew in my webs, so why shouldn't we catch snowflakes for a change?" Victoria looked up at the sky. "All we need now," she said, "is some snow." At that moment, as if by fairy magic, the sky was filled with a rush and tumble of snow. As the delicate flakes dropped towards the ground, one was caught for a few seconds on the threads of the spider's web. The puppy peered at it closely. At first, he couldn't make out anything, but then he saw the secret pictures he'd heard about. There were hundreds of tiny slivers of ice, all interlaced to make the most lovely patterns. As one flake melted and disappeared, another was ready to take its place, each one more beautiful than the last. Eventually, it stopped snowing, and there were no more flakes to catch in the web. "That was the loveliest thing I've ever seen," said the puppy. "Each time it snows, I will find a snowflake net of my own, so I can watch the pictures and remember my friends who showed me the snowflake secrets."